The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo de' Medici received word that would change everything. His most trusted advisor had betrayed him, his closest allies had turned, and the very foundations of his power were crumbling beneath his feet. Yet as he stood there, absorbing the magnitude of his fall, something extraordinary happened. Instead of despair, he felt a peculiar sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he was free from the illusion that had kept him weak, the belief that his current self was permanent, immutable, sacred. This is where true power begins, not in the preservation of who you are, but in the violent rejection of who you've allowed yourself to become. The world is filled with individuals who cling to their identities like drowning sailors clutching driftwood, never realizing that their desperate grip on familiar weakness is what pulls them under. They mistake fragility for authenticity, stagnation for stability, and comfort for strength. They are wrong on all counts. The path to genuine power demands something far more terrifying than external conquest, the complete annihilation of your current self in service of who you must become. This is not the gentle self-improvement peddled by those who profit from your continued mediocrity. This is the brutal mathematics of reinvention, where only those willing to sacrifice everything familiar can claim everything possible. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this principle intimately. When he penned his observations on power, he wasn't merely describing political strategy, he was revealing the fundamental architecture of human transformation. The same principles that govern the rise and fall of kingdoms apply with devastating precision to the individual soul. Fortune, as he noted, favors the audacious, but only after they have first learned to be audacious with themselves. Consider the moment when a caterpillar enters its chrysalis. The popular metaphor suggests a peaceful transformation, a gentle becoming. The reality is far more violent. The caterpillar doesn't simply grow wings, it dissolves completely. Every cell, every structure, every recognizable feature liquefies into primordial soup. Only then, from this complete destruction, does something entirely new emerge. The butterfly shares no structural continuity with its former self. It is a new creation, born from the willing death of what came before. Human transformation follows the same unforgiving logic, yet most people lack the courage to dissolve themselves completely. They attempt partial reinventions, cosmetic changes, surface-level adjustments. They rearrange the furniture while the foundation crumbles. They change their wardrobe while their character remains threadbare. They modify their behavior while their beliefs remain calcified. Such half measures are not transformation, they are sophisticated forms of procrastination. The first part of this brutal equation demands an honest audit of your current fragilities. Not your obvious weaknesses, everyone can identify those. Your fragilities are deeper, more insidious. They are the stories you tell yourself about what you're capable of, the invisible boundaries you've drawn around your potential, the comfortable excuses you've elevated to the status of immutable truths. Your fragilities are the parts of your identity you defend most fiercely precisely because you know, somewhere in the depths of your consciousness, that they are indefensible. Marcus had built his entire identity around being the reliable one. For 37 years, he had been the person others could depend on, the steady presence in every crisis, the one who sacrificed his own dreams to ensure everyone else's comfort. His colleagues praised his dependability. His family counted on his consistency. His friends valued his predictability. And Marcus was dying inside, suffocated by the very virtues that had once defined him. The fragility wasn't his willingness to help others, it was his inability to disappoint them. He had confused being needed with being valuable, reliability with importance, self-sacrifice with nobility. These weren't strengths, they were elegant prisons he had built around his own potential. Every yes to others was a no to himself. Every moment spent being who they expected him to be was a moment stolen from who he could become. The recognition of this fragility didn't arrive gently. It struck during a performance review where his supervisor, with casual brutality, described him as solid but unremarkable. The words hit with the force of revelation. Solid but unremarkable. Dependable but forgettable. Reliable but replaceable. In that moment, Marcus saw himself as others truly saw him, not as the indispensable pillar he imagined himself to be, but as human wallpaper, present, functional, and utterly ignorable. That night, alone in his apartment, Marcus performed the first act of genuine courage in his adult life. He wrote down every story he had been telling himself about who he was and what he was capable of. He listed every limitation he had accepted as natural law, every boundary he had drawn around his ambitions, every excuse he had polished to perfection. The list was longer than he had expected and more damning than he had feared. He was not looking at the architecture of his identity, he was staring at the blueprints of his cage. The brutal truth that emerges from such audits is that most of what you consider your personality is actually just fossilized fear. Your habits aren't preferences, they're avoidance strategies. Your routines aren't efficiency systems, they're anxiety management protocols. Your comfort zone isn't a place of strength, it's a museum of dead possibilities. The version of yourself you're so desperately trying to protect and improve isn't your authentic self, it's your safest self, your smallest self, your most defensible self. This realization creates what philosophers might call an existential crisis, but what practitioners of reinvention recognize as an opportunity. The Chinese character for crisis combines the symbols for danger and opportunity, but this translation, while popular, misses the deeper truth. Crisis doesn't contain opportunity, it creates the conditions where opportunity becomes mandatory. When your current self proves insufficient to your circumstances, you face a binary choice: evolve or become irrelevant. Yet even in crisis, most people choose familiarity over freedom. They would rather fail as themselves than succeed as someone they don't yet recognize. They treat their current identity like a sacred text rather than a rough draft. They defend their limitations with the same ferocity they should reserve for protecting their potential. This is the ultimate fragility, preferring the certainty of limitation to the uncertainty of possibility. The second phase of brutal reinvention requires something that most people find more terrifying than physical pain: the willingness to be temporarily incompetent. Every expert was once a beginner, but few beginners have the stomach to be temporarily terrible at something that matters to them. They want to transform, but they want to do so without the awkwardness of learning, the vulnerability of failure, the humiliation of public imperfection. Isabella had spent 15 years as a successful corporate lawyer, climbing steadily up the partnership track, accumulating accolades and bonuses with methodical precision. Her life was ordered, predictable, and deeply unsatisfying. She had always harbored dreams of building something of her own, creating rather than merely interpreting, leading rather than following. But these dreams remained carefully contained in the category of someday, a distant destination she would reach after she had secured enough money, gained enough experience, built enough connections. The catalyst for her transformation arrived in the form of a panic attack during a particularly tedious contract negotiation. As she sat in the conference room, surrounded by documents that suddenly seemed to represent everything she didn't want her life to become, her chest tightened and her vision blurred. She excused herself, locked herself in the bathroom, and confronted the undeniable truth: she was suffocating on her own success. That evening, instead of going home to her carefully curated apartment with its carefully selected furniture and carefully managed life, she drove to the business district and walked among the startups and small companies that had always seemed too risky, too uncertain, too far from the safe path she had chosen. She watched through windows at people who looked tired but energized, stressed but purposeful, uncertain but alive. For the first time in years, she felt something she had forgotten was possible: envy for someone else's problems. The decision to leave the law firm wasn't made in a moment of inspiration, it was made in a moment of calculation. Isabella applied the same analytical rigor she had used to evaluate contracts to evaluate her own life. She listed the costs of staying, the slow death of ambition, the gradual calcification of dreams, the mounting resentment toward a life that felt like an elaborate performance. Then, she listed the costs of leaving: financial uncertainty, professional setback, social disapproval, and the terrifying possibility of failure. The mathematics were clear. The cost of staying was everything she could become. The cost of leaving was everything she currently was. When framed properly, it wasn't even a choice. But knowing what needed to be done and having the courage to do it are separated by a chasm that has swallowed more dreams than any external obstacle. Isabella spent 3 months in what she later described as strategic procrastination, researching endlessly, planning obsessively, waiting for the perfect moment that would never arrive. She was trying to engineer a transformation that involved no risk, a leap that required no faith, a reinvention that preserved all the security she would need to abandon. The breakthrough came when she realized she was trying to solve the wrong problem. She had been asking how to minimize the risks of change when she should have been asking how to maximize the costs of staying the same. Instead of building a bridge to her new life, she needed to burn the bridge to her old one. Instead of creating safety nets, she needed to make her current position untenable. On a Tuesday morning in March, without ceremony or fanfare, Isabella submitted her resignation. No dramatic speech, no elaborate exit strategy, no careful transition plan. She simply decided that the person she had been was no longer someone she could afford to remain. The relief was immediate and terrifying. She had created a void that could only be filled by becoming someone she had never been before. The months that followed were a masterclass in productive discomfort. Isabella discovered that competence in one domain provides no immunity against incompetence in another. The skills that had made her an excellent lawyer, analytical thinking, risk assessment, careful deliberation, were often counterproductive in the world of entrepreneurship, where speed mattered more than perfection and intuition often trumped analysis. She failed at things that should have been simple. She made mistakes that embarrassed her. She encountered problems she couldn't think her way out of. But something remarkable happened in the midst of this controlled chaos. She began to remember what learning felt like. Not the careful acquisition of predetermined knowledge that had characterized her professional development, but the wild, unpredictable process of discovery that had made childhood so exhilarating. Each failure became data rather than defeat. Each setback revealed new possibilities rather than confirming old limitations. She was not becoming a different person, she was discovering that the person she had always been was far more capable and resilient than the narrow role she had been playing suggested. The lawyer had been a character she had performed so convincingly that she had forgotten she was acting. This is the paradox of reinvention: you must become someone new to discover who you have always been. The process strips away the accumulated layers of others' expectations, social conditioning, and safe choices to reveal the core of possibility that exists beneath. But this archaeology of the self requires tools that most people are unwilling to wield: uncertainty, discomfort, and the temporary abandonment of expertise. The third and most crucial phase of brutal reinvention involves the cultivation of what might be called productive obsession, the ability to channel the energy of dissatisfaction into the focused pursuit of a single, overwhelming purpose. This is not the balanced approach to life that wellness experts advocate. This is not the sustainable pace that productivity gurus recommend. This is the recognition that extraordinary results require extraordinary commitment, and extraordinary commitment looks like madness to those committed to ordinary outcomes. History's most significant transformations, both personal and societal, have been driven by individuals who understood that moderation is the enemy of metamorphosis. They didn't seek work-life balance, they sought work-life integration so complete that the distinction became meaningless. They didn't pursue multiple interests, they pursued one interest with such intensity that it refracted into multiple dimensions. They didn't aim for sustainable progress, they aimed for unsustainable breakthrough that would create new baselines of possibility. David had always been fascinated by the intersection of technology and human behavior, but his fascination had remained safely academic, confined to after-work reading and weekend conversations. He worked as a mid-level product manager at a company whose products he found tolerable, surrounded by colleagues whose ambitions matched the modesty of their circumstances. His days were filled with meetings about meetings, reports about reports, and decisions that felt significant in the moment but dissolved into irrelevance by the following week. The transformation began not with inspiration but with disgust. During a particularly pointless strategy session where 12 people spent 3 hours discussing the positioning of a button on a web page that would be seen by dozens of users, David felt something snap inside him. Not anger, exactly, but a sudden, crystalline clarity about the absolute waste of human potential happening in that conference room. These weren't evil people, they were smart, capable individuals who had somehow convinced themselves that their elaborate exercises in irrelevance constituted meaningful work. That evening, instead of his usual routine of dinner, television, and early sleep, David began what would become his practice of controlled obsession. He set aside everything in his life that wasn't directly contributing to his understanding of human behavior in digital environments. No more casual socializing, no more random entertainment consumption, no more activities justified by the vague category of relaxation. Every hour outside of his day job was dedicated to research, experimentation, and the development of ideas that might actually matter. the social costs were immediate and significant. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings he consistently declined. Family members expressed concern about his unhealthy focus on work. Colleagues noted his decreased participation in office social rituals. But David had discovered something that made these sacrifices feel like eliminations of distraction rather than deprivation of pleasure: the intoxicating experience of rapid learning applied to problems he actually cared about solving. Within 6 months, his understanding of user psychology had advanced more than it had in the previous 6 years of casual interest. He had built prototypes, conducted experiments, and developed frameworks that transformed abstract theories into actionable insights. More importantly, he had developed what he later recognized as the most valuable skill in any field: the ability to see patterns that others missed because he was looking more carefully at problems they were only glancing at. The breakthrough came when he realized that most digital products failed not because of technical limitations but because their creators didn't understand the emotional journey users experienced when interacting with technology. He developed a framework for mapping these emotional states to specific design decisions, tested it across multiple applications, and discovered that he could predict user behavior with startling accuracy. But knowledge without application is merely sophisticated entertainment. David faced the same challenge that confronts every person who develops expertise outside their official role: the need to translate private insight into public value. He couldn't remain a product manager who happened to have revolutionary ideas about user experience. He needed to become someone whose expertise was so valuable that organizations would reorganize around his insights rather than expecting him to conform to their existing structures. This required a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance, a willingness to claim authority he had not been granted, to present himself as an expert in a field where his credentials were entirely self-created. It meant pitching ideas to companies that had never heard of him, speaking at conferences where he had no business being invited, and positioning himself as a thought leader in a space already crowded with established authorities. The rejection was swift and frequent. Emails went unanswered, proposals were dismissed, and applications were declined. But David had learned something crucial during his months of obsessive study: persistence applied to the right problem at the right time is indistinguishable from genius. He wasn't trying to convince everyone, he was trying to find the few people who were ready to see what he was seeing. The breakthrough came through the smallest possible door: a startup founder who was struggling with user retention and willing to try anything that might work. David's framework not only solved their immediate problem but revealed opportunities they hadn't known existed. Within 3 months, their user engagement metrics had improved by orders of magnitude, and word began to spread through the tight networks that connect innovative companies. But success in one context is merely permission to attempt success in larger contexts. David found himself facing the classic challenge of scaling insight: how to maintain the intensity and precision that had created his breakthrough while expanding his impact beyond what his individual efforts could achieve. This required yet another transformation: from someone who solved problems to someone who taught others to solve problems, from an expert to an expert maker. The process of teaching others forced David to examine his own methods with new rigor. He discovered that much of what he had been doing intuitively could be systematized, measured, and replicated. His private obsession became a public methodology. His individual insights became organizational capabilities. His personal transformation became a template that others could follow. But perhaps the most significant realization was that his obsession had not been with user experience design at all, it had been with the deeper question of how human potential gets unlocked or constrained by the systems we create. Digital interfaces were merely the most immediate manifestation of this broader challenge. He had stumbled onto his life's work by following his dissatisfaction far enough to discover what lay beneath it. This is the ultimate lesson of brutal reinvention: the process of becoming who you need to be inevitably reveals purposes you couldn't have imagined while you were still who you used to be. The path of transformation doesn't lead to a predetermined destination, it leads to destinations that become visible only after you have developed the vision to see them. Purpose isn't discovered through contemplation, it's uncovered through action, revealed through commitment, and refined through the focused application of whatever capabilities you're willing to develop. The individuals who achieve profound transformation share certain characteristics that distinguish them from those who remain trapped in cycles of comfortable limitation. They understand that identity is not a fact to be discovered but a decision to be made and remade continuously. They recognize that their current circumstances are not verdicts on their potential but simply the results of decisions they can choose to make differently. They embrace temporary incompetence as the price of permanent growth and view discomfort as information rather than punishment. Most importantly, they understand that the world is not waiting for them to become ready. There is no perfect moment for transformation, no ideal set of circumstances for reinvention, no amount of preparation that eliminates the need for courage. The bridge to your new life is built from the other side. You have to leap before you can land, trust before you can see, become before you can know. The mathematics of this transformation are elegant in their simplicity. Every day you spend being who you've always been is a day you're not spending becoming who you need to be. Every hour invested in protecting your current identity is an hour stolen from developing your future capabilities. Every choice to remain comfortable is a choice to become obsolete. Yet the world is designed to discourage such mathematics. Society rewards consistency, organizations value predictability, and relationships often depend on others being able to count on you remaining fundamentally unchanged. The people in your life have adapted to who you are, and they have legitimate interests in you remaining adaptable to their expectations. Your transformation, no matter how positive for you, represents disruption for them. This creates one of the most challenging aspects of personal reinvention, the need to manage the social consequences of change while maintaining the momentum of transformation. The people who care about you will often be the most resistant to your evolution, not because they want to limit you but because they fear losing the version of you they've learned to love. Your growth can feel like rejection to those who have organized their lives around your current limitations. Sarah had built her entire social identity around being the friend who listened. For 20 years, she had been the one people called during crises, the shoulder others cried on, the confidant who absorbed everyone else's emotional overflow. Her friendships were structured around this dynamic, and her sense of worth was deeply tied to being needed in this specific way. She had become professionally good at other people's problems and amateur at her own possibilities. The shift began when she realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her about her dreams rather than seeking advice about theirs. Her relationships had become elaborate one-way streets where she provided emotional labor in exchange for the illusion of intimacy. She was the supporting character in everyone else's story, including her own. The decision to change this dynamic required her to violate social contracts that had been years in the making. When friends called seeking her usual emotional availability, she began responding differently, not with rejection, but with boundaries that prioritized her own development alongside their needs. She started sharing her own ambitions instead of simply validating theirs. She became selectively unavailable to others so she could become more available to herself. The resistance was immediate and intense. Friends accused her of becoming selfish, family members expressed concern about her changing priorities, and several relationships simply withered when they proved unable to adapt to her new boundaries. But something remarkable emerged from this social reorganization. The people who remained became allies in her transformation rather than obstacles to it. Her relationships became based on mutual growth rather than one-sided caretaking. This winnowing of social connections is perhaps the most underestimated aspect of personal transformation. The version of you that others fell in love with, became dependent on, or learned to manage may need to die for the version you're becoming to fully live. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or abandoning those who have supported you, it means being honest about the fact that your growth may require them to grow as well, and not everyone will choose to make that journey with you. The brutal truth is that some relationships are based on your limitations rather than your potential, and these relationships become increasingly untenable as you expand beyond the boundaries they were designed to accommodate. The friend who bonds with you over shared complaints about your circumstances may resist your efforts to change those circumstances. The family member who enjoys feeling superior to your struggles may unconsciously sabotage your attempts to overcome them. The colleague who depends on your predictable cooperation may undermine your efforts to expand your influence. Recognizing these dynamics doesn't require becoming cynical about human nature, it requires becoming realistic about human psychology. People resist change, even positive change, because change introduces uncertainty into systems that have achieved stability. Your transformation forces everyone around you to reconsider their own choices, examine their own limitations, and confront their own unused potential. Some will be inspired by your example, others will be threatened by it. The key is learning to distinguish between resistance that emerges from care and resistance that emerges from control. Those who love you will eventually support your growth even if they initially fear it. Those who need to control you will escalate their resistance as your independence increases. The former requires patience and communication, the latter requires boundaries and, sometimes, distance. But, the most insidious resistance often comes not from others but from the internalized voices that have learned to speak in the language of prudence, responsibility, and realism. These voices are not trying to protect you from failure, they're trying to protect you from the possibility of success that would invalidate everything they've convinced you to believe about your limitations. The voice that warns you about being unrealistic is often protecting you from discovering just how much reality you're capable of creating. The voice that counsels patience may be delaying your progress indefinitely. The voice that advocates for balance might be preventing you from achieving the focused intensity that breakthrough requires. These voices have learned to sound like wisdom, but they often function as sophisticated forms of procrastination. Learning to distinguish between legitimate caution and disguised fear becomes crucial as the stakes of your transformation increase. Real wisdom rarely sounds wise, it usually sounds risky, uncomfortable, and slightly insane to minds that have been trained to equate safety with intelligence. The most dangerous advice you'll receive often comes wrapped in the language of caring concern and delivered by people who have never attempted what you're trying to achieve. This is why the most successful transformations often happen in relative isolation from well-meaning advisors who mistake their own limitations for universal constraints. The process requires developing an internal compass calibrated to your own potential rather than others' comfort levels. It means learning to trust insights that can't be validated by consensus and pursuing paths that can't be approved by committee. The cultivation of this internal authority represents perhaps the most significant psychological shift in the transformation process. Most people spend their lives seeking external validation for their choices, external permission for their ambitions, and external confirmation that their efforts are worthwhile. They treat other people's opinions as more reliable than their own instincts and other people's experience as more relevant than their own experimentation. But the path to extraordinary results requires developing what might be called sovereign judgment, the ability to evaluate your own progress, assess your own potential, and make your own decisions based on standards you set for yourself rather than standards others set for you. This doesn't mean becoming immune to feedback or resistant to input, it means developing the discernment to distinguish between information that serves your growth and information that serves others' comfort. The development of sovereign judgment often begins with the recognition that most advice is autobiography, people telling you what worked for them, in their circumstances, given their capabilities and limitations, during their era. This doesn't make their advice wrong, but it makes it incomplete when applied to your unique situation. Their success strategies may be your failure strategies. Their timing may be your mistiming. Their opportunities may be your distractions. James had spent 3 years trying to follow the business-building advice of successful entrepreneurs, implementing their strategies with meticulous precision and achieving mediocre results with remarkable consistency. Every book he read, every course he took, and every mentor he followed provided blueprints that seemed logical, proven, and practical. Yet his attempts to execute these blueprints felt like trying to wear clothes tailored for someone else's body, technically functional but fundamentally uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when he stopped asking, "What did they do?" and started asking, "What do I need to do?" This shift in questioning revealed that he had been trying to succeed at someone else's version of success rather than developing his own. He had been benchmarking his progress against their milestones rather than defining milestones that reflected his unique combination of strengths, interests, and circumstances. The process of developing his own methodology required him to become a student of his own learning patterns, energy cycles, and motivational triggers. He discovered that he worked best in intense sprints followed by complete recovery rather than the steady, consistent effort that most productivity systems recommended. He learned that he generated his best ideas through physical movement rather than seated contemplation. He found that he was motivated more by solving specific problems for specific people than by abstract concepts of market opportunity or financial reward. These insights couldn't have been gleaned from books or courses because they were specific to the peculiar architecture of his individual psychology. They required direct experimentation, careful observation, and the willingness to trust patterns that emerged from his own experience even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. But personal methodology is only valuable if it produces results that matter to you rather than results that impress others. This distinction becomes crucial as you develop the capabilities that set you apart from those following conventional paths. The temptation to measure your progress against standard benchmarks remains strong, but these benchmarks often reflect the priorities and possibilities of people whose circumstances bear little resemblance to your own. The development of personalized success metrics requires answering questions that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What would have to be true about your life for you to consider it extraordinarily well lived? What would you need to accomplish for your time on Earth to feel like it mattered? What legacy would you need to create for your existence to feel justified? These questions have no correct answers, only personal ones, but most people never ask them directly enough to develop personal ones. Instead, they adopt borrowed definitions of success and spend decades pursuing goals that don't reflect their deepest interests or utilize their greatest strengths. They climb ladders leaning against walls they never chose. They solve problems they don't care about solving. They develop capabilities they don't enjoy using. They achieve recognition in fields that don't inspire them. Then, they wonder why success feels hollow and accomplishment feels empty. The brutal honesty required to answer these foundational questions often reveals that much of what you've been working toward represents someone else's definition of a life worth living rather than your own. This recognition can be devastating. Years of effort suddenly seem misdirected, achievements lose their significance, and the future you've been building toward no longer seems worth reaching. But this devastation is actually liberation in disguise. The recognition that you've been climbing the wrong mountain gives you permission to descend and choose a different peak. The realization that your goals don't reflect your values creates space to develop goals that do. The acknowledgement that your current path leads to a destination you don't want to reach allows you to chart a course towards somewhere you do. This process of goal archaeology, examining your ambitions to determine which ones are actually yours, often reveals that your deepest motivations have been obscured by layers of social conditioning, parental expectations, and peer pressure. The work you're truly called to do may bear little resemblance to the work you've been trained to want. The life that would actually fulfill you may look nothing like the life you've been taught to pursue. Marcus had spent 15 years building expertise in financial analysis, climbing steadily through the hierarchy of a prestigious consulting firm, and accumulating the credentials that marked him as successful in his field. His work was intellectually challenging, financially rewarding, and socially respected. By every conventional measure, he had achieved exactly what ambitious young people were supposed to achieve. Yet he felt like he was slowly suffocating on his own success. The catalyst for his transformation came through an unexpected source, volunteering at a local community center where he helped adults develop basic financial literacy. What he had expected to be a simple way to give back became a revelation about the kind of work that actually energized him. Instead of analyzing abstract financial structures for already wealthy corporations, he was helping real people solve real problems that directly impacted their quality of life. The contrast was stark and undeniable. At work, he was an expert performing complex analysis that felt increasingly meaningless. At the community center, he was a teacher helping people understand concepts that could change their lives. At work, he was optimizing someone else's profits. At the community center, he was expanding someone else's possibilities. At work, he felt competent but disconnected. At the community center, he felt useful and alive. But recognizing what you're called to do and having the courage to restructure your life around it are separated by a chasm that has swallowed more dreams than any external obstacle. Marcus spent months trying to figure out how to transition from his current role to something more aligned with his true interests without sacrificing the financial security and professional status he had worked years to achieve. He was trying to engineer a transformation that involved no loss, a career change that required no sacrifice, a reinvention that preserved all the benefits of his current situation. The breakthrough came when he realized he was asking the wrong question. Instead of how can I change my career without losing anything, he needed to ask what am I willing to lose to gain alignment with my purpose. The first question had no answer because it was based on the impossible premise that transformation could occur without transformation. The second question had multiple answers because it was based on the recognition that meaningful change requires meaningful sacrifice. The mathematics were clear once he framed them properly. He was trading 8 hours a day of work that drained him for 8 hours a day of work that energized him. He was exchanging a high salary that supported a lifestyle he didn't particularly enjoy for a lower salary that supported work he found deeply meaningful. He was swapping prestigious credentials that impressed people he didn't care about impressing for useful skills that served people he actually wanted to help. The decision to leave consulting and start his own financial education practice required every lesson he had learned about brutal reinvention. He had to deny the fragility that made him cling to external validation and find fuel in a purpose that others might not understand. He had to accept temporary incompetence in areas where he had never worked professionally while leveraging competencies he had developed accidentally. He had to trust his own judgment about what constituted a life worth living rather than accepting society's definitions of success and failure. The transition was exactly as difficult as he had feared and exactly as rewarding as he had hoped. His income dropped significantly, his professional status became ambiguous, and his career trajectory became unpredictable. But his energy increased, his sense of purpose clarified, and his daily experience of work transformed from obligation to opportunity. He was no longer performing someone else's version of success, he was creating his own. Within 2 years, his practice had grown to the point where his income exceeded what he had been earning as a consultant, but this was almost beside the point. The real transformation wasn't financial, it was psychological. He had proven to himself that he could identify what he was truly called to do and restructure his life around it. He had developed the capabilities necessary to create value in alignment with his values. He had become the kind of person who chose purpose over comfort, meaning over money, and authenticity over approval. But, perhaps most importantly, he had learned to trust the process of transformation itself. He understood viscerally that every meaningful change requires a period of uncertainty, every significant growth demands temporary discomfort, and every authentic reinvention involves abandoning identities that no longer serve the person you're becoming. This knowledge became a foundation for continuous evolution rather than a one-time career change. The individuals who achieve sustained transformation understand that reinvention is not a destination but a capacity, the ability to continually evolve in response to changing circumstances, expanding awareness, and deepening understanding of what's possible. They don't transform once and then maintain their new identity, they develop the psychological flexibility to keep transforming as their consciousness grows and their circumstances shift. This recognition fundamentally changes how you approach the challenges and opportunities that emerge throughout your life. Instead of viewing setbacks as evidence that you've chosen the wrong path, you see them as information about how your path might need to evolve. Instead of treating success as a destination you've reached, you treat it as a platform from which you can reach even further. Instead of clinging to identities that have served you well, you remain open to identities that might serve you better. The development of this meta-skill, the ability to transform your ability to transform, represents the highest level of personal development. It moves beyond specific techniques or strategies to cultivate the underlying psychological architecture that makes continuous growth possible. It's the difference between learning to solve particular problems and learning to learn how to solve whatever problems emerge. Sarah had successfully transitioned from corporate marketing to running her own creative agency, navigating all the predictable challenges of entrepreneurship and achieving the kind of professional independence she had always wanted. But, 3 years into building her business, she encountered a problem she hadn't anticipated. The work that had excited her as an escape from corporate constraints had become constraining in its own way. The creative projects that had once felt liberating now felt repetitive. The client relationships that had seemed refreshingly direct now seemed demanding and draining. The independence that had been so appealing was beginning to feel like isolation. She had successfully reinvented herself once, but the person she had become was already feeling inadequate to the person she sensed she could become next. This second-order challenge, needing to transform after you've already transformed, requires a different kind of courage than initial reinvention. The first transformation was driven by dissatisfaction with who she had been. This one would need to be driven by attraction to who she might become, even though that person was still undefined. She would need to abandon a successful identity to pursue a successful identity that didn't yet exist. The process began with the same kind of honest audit that had initiated her first transformation, but this time she was examining strengths rather than limitations, successes rather than failures, and possibilities rather than problems. She discovered that what she loved most about her work wasn't the creative output but the process of helping clients discover what they were truly trying to communicate. She wasn't just designing marketing materials, she was helping organizations clarify their purpose and find their voice. This insight revealed a new direction that hadn't been visible when she was focused on escaping her corporate job. She could evolve from someone who created communications to someone who helped others discover what they needed to communicate. From a service provider to a strategic partner. From someone who executed other people's visions to someone who helped others clarify their own. But, this evolution would require developing capabilities she had never needed as a designer: facilitation skills, psychological insight, strategic thinking at an organizational level. She would need to position herself not as a creative expert but as a business advisor. She would need to charge for thinking rather than making, for insight rather than output, for transformation rather than execution. The transition felt remarkably similar to her original transformation, but it was actually far more sophisticated. She was no longer abandoning an identity that wasn't working, she was evolving an identity that was working into an identity that might work even better. She wasn't running from something that drained her, she was running towards something that might energize her even more. She wasn't solving a problem, she was optimizing a solution. This kind of evolution from strength rather than from weakness represents the highest form of personal development. It requires the psychological security to abandon what's working in pursuit of what might work better. It demands the vision to see possibilities that exist beyond your current success rather than just beyond your current problems. It calls for the courage to disappoint people who are satisfied with your current contributions in service of people who might benefit from your future ones. The individuals who master this level of transformation understand that every identity, no matter how successful, is temporary. They treat their current capabilities as foundations for future capabilities rather than destinations in themselves. They view their achievements as proof of what they can do rather than definitions of what they should continue doing. They remain students of their own potential even after becoming teachers to others. This mindset requires developing what might be called temporal flexibility, the ability to hold your current identity lightly enough that you can evolve it as circumstances require while holding it firmly enough that you can create value in the present. It's the difference between being attached to who you are and being committed to who you're becoming. But, perhaps the most important insight that emerges from sustained transformation is that the process itself becomes a source of meaning that transcends any particular outcome. The willingness to continuously evolve in response to expanding awareness and changing circumstances becomes a way of honoring the full potential of human consciousness. The commitment to growth becomes a form of gratitude for the gift of existence itself. The path of brutal reinvention ultimately leads to a profound recognition: you are not a fixed entity trying to find your place in the world, you are a dynamic process of becoming, constantly creating both yourself and your circumstances through the choices you make about who to be and how to show up. Your identity is not something you discover, it's something you decide. Your purpose is not something you find, it's something you create. Your limitations are not facts about reality, they're hypotheses about possibility that can be tested and revised. This recognition transforms every challenge from a verdict about your capabilities into an experiment in expanding them. Every failure becomes data about what adjustments are needed rather than evidence about what you're not capable of achieving. Every success becomes a platform for attempting something even more ambitious rather than a destination where you can finally rest. The individuals who understand this most deeply tend to develop a particular kind of presence, simultaneously grounded in who they are and open to who they might become. They carry themselves with the confidence of people who have proven they can transform, combined with the humility of people who know they still have more transforming to do. They are solid enough to be dependable and fluid enough to remain relevant. They are defined enough to create value and undefined enough to continue growing. They also tend to develop an unusual relationship with time. Instead of viewing their lives as linear progressions from birth to death, they experience them as spiral evolutions where they revisit similar themes and challenges at progressively deeper levels of understanding and capability. They don't graduate from fundamental questions about purpose, meaning, and potential, they develop more sophisticated ways of engaging with these questions as their consciousness expands and their influence grows. Most importantly, they understand that the work of transformation is never finished because the possibilities for human growth are never exhausted. Every level of development reveals new possibilities for development. Every expansion of capability creates new demands for capability. Every increase in consciousness generates new responsibilities for using that consciousness in service of something greater than personal satisfaction. This is perhaps the most brutal recognition of all: the path of authentic development has no endpoint, no graduation, no final destination where you can declare yourself complete. It is an endless journey of becoming that demands everything you have to give and, then, asks for more. It requires you to sacrifice every comfortable limitation and transcend every familiar identity in service of possibilities you can barely imagine. Yet for those who choose this path, the brutality transforms into something that can only be called love, love for the full potential of human existence, love for the magnificent complexity of consciousness itself, love for the endless possibilities that emerge when someone decides to deny their fragility and fuel their purpose with the kind of commitment that makes transformation not just possible but inevitable. The world needs individuals who are willing to undergo this kind of transformation because the challenges we face collectively require capabilities that don't yet exist and solutions that haven't yet been imagined. The problems of our time cannot be solved by people who remain who they have always been. They require people who are willing to become who they have never been in service of creating what has never existed. This is the ultimate purpose of brutal reinvention, not personal fulfillment, though that often results, not individual success, though that frequently emerges, but the development of human capabilities that can address human challenges at the scale and complexity they actually exist. Your transformation is not just about you, it's your contribution to the evolution of human consciousness itself. The question is not whether you need to transform. The forces of change guarantee that your current identity will become inadequate to future circumstances. The question is whether you will direct your own transformation or allow it to be imposed on you by circumstances you didn't choose. Whether you will reinvent yourself in alignment with your deepest purpose or be reinvented by pressures that serve purposes you don't share. The brutal mathematics remain the same. Every day you spend protecting who you are is a day you're not spending becoming who you need to be. Every hour invested in maintaining comfortable limitations is an hour stolen from developing uncomfortable capabilities. Every choice to remain familiar is a choice to become irrelevant. But, for those who choose the path of intentional transformation, who commit to denying their fragility and fueling their purpose with the kind of intensity that makes breakthrough inevitable, the rewards transcend anything that can be achieved through conventional means. They don't just change their circumstances, they expand their capacity to create circumstances. They don't just solve their problems, they develop the ability to solve problems they couldn't have imagined before they became the kind of person capable of imagining them. They become living proof that human potential is not fixed, that circumstances are not permanent, and that the future can be different from the past if someone has the courage to become different from who they used to be. They become evidence of what's possible when someone decides that their current self is not their final self, that their present limitations are not their permanent limitations, and that their past performance is not a prediction of their future possibilities. This is the gift they give to everyone whose life they touch, the demonstration that transformation is possible, that growth never has to stop, and that the human capacity for becoming is limited only by the human willingness to deny fragility and fuel purpose with the kind of commitment that makes miracles look like methodology. In the end, the brutal reinvention they'll never anticipate is not brutal because it causes suffering, it's brutal because it eliminates everything that isn't essential to who you're becoming. It's not anticipated because most people can't imagine abandoning everything familiar in service of possibilities they can't yet see. It's not cruel but precise, not destructive but creative, not ending but beginning. It is the mathematics of becoming applied with the intensity necessary to solve for the variable that matters most, the person you're capable of being when you stop accepting limitation as natural law and start treating transformation as the most natural response to a world that demands everything you have to give and, then, asks for more. The choice, as always, remains yours. But the window for choosing grows smaller every day, and the cost of not choosing grows larger with every opportunity you allow to pass while you remain who you have always been instead of becoming who you could still be. The time for brutal reinvention is always now. The question is whether now is when you'll finally begin.